On August 11th, 2025, the West Philippine Sea almost witnessed a major catastrophe. Two Chinese vessels, a Coast Guard cutter and a PLA Navy destroyer, slammed into each other near the much-disputed Scarborough Shoal. The reason? They were aggressively chasing a smaller Philippine Coast Guard vessel. But here's the chilling part. The small Philippine Coast Guard patrol ship narrowly avoided collision with the much larger Chinese destroyer by just a few meters. Now, what if this played out differently? Would it be a larger international incident if the Chinese destroyer had hit that Philippine Coast Guard instead? What could be the Philippine response? What would be the international repercussions? Let's examine this. What could have been the worst-case scenario? Now, here is what actually happened. On the early morning of August 11th, just 10.5 nautical miles east of Scarborough Shoal, the Philippine Coast Guard ship BRP Suluan was on a humanitarian mission, delivering desperately needed fuel and supplies to Filipino fishermen in the area. But it didn't take long before Chinese vessels took notice and moved in. China Coast Guard cutter 3104 and a Type 052D PLN destroyer took exception and aggressively chased the Philippine Coast Guard vessel, even blasting it with a water cannon. Now, some analysts even deemed the involvement of a 157-meter Navy destroyer as overkill in this scenario. However, this is what China wants the world to see, that they own the entire South China Sea, and they have the might to do so. In the chaos, Chinese Coast Guard 3104 veered too far and was outmaneuvered by the Philippine Coast Guard, causing it to collide head-on with the Chinese Navy destroyer, the Type 052D Guilin, hull number 164. The Chinese Coast Guard cutter's bow was crushed, leaving it unseaworthy, and upon further video inspection, shows evidence of at least 3 Chinese personnel in the bow of the ship seconds before impact. The Philippine Coast Guard offered to help the damaged Chinese ship and perhaps assist in rescue efforts, but radio communications were silent from the Chinese vessels.
9701, we have medical personnel on board. Should you need any assistance, we are willing to provide assistance. Over.
Now here is what many missed in the headlines. It is just how close this was to a Philippine tragedy. Based on video analysis, the Philippine Coast Guard vessel, BRP Suluan, narrowly passed within just a few meters of the Chinese destroyer. With the margin of error practically zero, a single wrong maneuver, one miscalculation, one slip in judgment from the captain of the Suluan, and the much smaller Philippine Coast Guard vessel could have been cut in half, resulting in injuries or probable casualties to the Filipino crew on board. This was too close for comfort. We're talking about the difference between an embarrassing incident for China and a deadly international crisis for Manila. So why did this happen at all? On paper, the answer is simple. International maritime law, known as COLREGS, or the Convention on the International Regulations for Preventing Collisions at Sea, is crystal clear. When there's even a risk of collision, both vessels are obligated to take early and substantial action to avoid danger. It's not a suggestion. It's a rule that keeps mariners safe worldwide. And when it comes to warships, there's an extra layer of protection. Naval vessels operating near each other are guided by cues, the code for unplanned encounters at sea. This agreement was specifically designed to prevent accidents or misunderstandings from escalating into conflicts. But here in the South China Sea, those rules are being tossed overboard. Instead of cautious maneuvering and clear communication, what we're seeing is something closer to a high-stakes game of chicken. Ships weighing thousands of tons, carrying live crews, and in some cases armed with missiles, are being steered within meters of each other, pushing the limits of seamanship and diplomacy. It's not just reckless, it's a deliberate strategy of intimidation, where safety takes a backseat to political theater, and the margin for error? Almost non-existent. So, what if the Chinese destroyer had actually smashed into BRP Suluan? Let's break this down in real terms. The Chinese Type 052D is no ordinary vessel. It's a frontline guided missile destroyer, 157 meters long and weighing in at 7,500 tons. Built with thick steel plating, reinforced hull frames, and the raw momentum of a war machine designed to withstand missile strikes. Now compare that to the much smaller BRP Suluan, a humble Philippine Coast Guard patrol cutter, just 44 meters in length, displacing barely 300 tons. It's built for surveillance and search and rescue, not for collisions with warships. Do the math. The Chinese destroyer outweighs the cutter by a factor of 25. In naval terms, that's like a semi-truck plowing into a motorcycle. Even at low speeds, the physics here are brutal. The destroyer's mass and momentum would have carved straight through the cutter's hull, ripping open steel like paper, shearing compartments in half, and sending torrents of seawater flooding inside within seconds. The Suluan's crew would have had little chance to react. In the best case, the vessel would sink rapidly. In the worst case, sailors could be trapped, crushed, or swept into the sea amidst chaos. And this isn't speculation, it's reality. Naval collision records show that ships of even comparable size can suffer devastating losses. For a vessel as small as the Suluan, colliding with a warship of that magnitude almost certainly means crippling damage and casualties. We could have been talking not about a narrow escape, but about a national tragedy, lives lost, and a direct clash between China and the Philippines igniting within minutes. Politically, Manila's response would have been immediate. President Marcos has said it before. If a Filipino is killed by a willful act, that's very, very close to an act of war. Even without fatalities, the optics of a Chinese naval destroyer crushing a Philippine Coast Guard ship would trigger a national crisis. And then there's the Philippine longtime ally, the United States. Washington has repeated time and again, the Mutual Defense Treaty covers attacks on Philippine public vessels, including Coast Guard ships in the South China Sea. Now, the big question is, was it an accident or an act of aggression? That distinction would decide if the Mutual Defense Treaty is invoked. Here's the hard truth. If such a collision were classified as an accident, the Mutual Defense Treaty wouldn't automatically trigger armed retaliation. What you'd see instead is a flurry of high-stakes diplomacy, Manila presenting evidence, allies reviewing satellite footage, and emergency summits convened to cool tempers. But if the incident appeared deliberate, reckless, or resulted in serious casualties, the equation changes dramatically. In that scenario, the Philippines could invoke the MDT, opening the door for immediate consultations with Washington. And if the threat was deemed ongoing, that could mean U.S. and allied naval forces deploying rapidly into the West Philippine Sea. Not just as a deterrent, but as a visible signal to Beijing that any further aggression would have consequences. This near miss also reminds us Scarborough Shoal is well inside the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, as reaffirmed by the 2016 arbitral ruling under UNCLOS. China continues to claim this part as theirs, and through aggressive maneuvers, water cannons, blockades, and now this collision, violate those rules while raising the risk of miscalculation that could spiral into open conflict. And that's why analysts called August 11th incident the best-case scenario. This is, instead of China colliding with the Philippines, it was China colliding with itself. But imagine the alternative, a Philippine cutter smashed in half, Filipino lives lost, and the Mutual Defense Treaty tested overnight. That's how close the Philippines came to a possible armed conflict. So what do you think? If a Chinese destroyer had hit a Philippine Coast Guard ship, should the Mutual Defense Treaty have been triggered? Or would diplomacy still be the best option? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more in-depth breakdowns.